Welcome to the Sports Spectrum Podcast, where faith and sports collide. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
This is episode number 22 of the Sports Spectrum Podcast. My name is Jason Romano. Thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. As always, you can subscribe and you can download the podcast on iTunes and Google Play and Stitcher and everywhere podcasts are available. And as always, go to sportsspectrum.com. That's where we have daily devotionals. We have articles, consistent content every single day on the intersection of faith and sports, as well as the podcast. The podcast is there on the website to listen to for free. We also have podcast notes, our favorite quotes, as well as sort of a timeline of the topics that we discuss in each podcast interview. So go check it out at sportsspectrum.com. Today's guest is Robby Shaffer. Now, he is a drummer for the band MercyMe. Now, a few years back, probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I got connected with a guy named Bart Millard, who is the lead singer of MercyMe, connected through social media, and they were in town in Connecticut, and they're huge sports fans. I mean, they are gigantic sports fans, especially baseball, and they wanted to come by ESPN and see the studios and get a tour. So I offered that up, and we set up a date, and they came, and they got to see all the different areas of ESPN, the TV studios, the radio studios, some of the different areas that we record podcasts, and certainly the cafeteria and the behind the scenes in the control room. So it was really a cool day for them to see ESPN because they're big sports fans. But for me, I'm a huge MercyMe fan. I love their music. I love their message. And for me to be walking these guys around was kind of surreal in a lot of ways. So I connected with MercyMe and with Bart, and also connected with Robby. And Robby is the drummer, Robby Shaffer. And he had some family here in Connecticut and also was able to come up for a tour a few years later. And Robby and I became friends. And just in talking to Robby and getting to know him and knowing his heart for the Lord, but his passion for sports. He loves sports. I just thought it would be great to have him here on the podcast and kind of share his story and talk to him about MercyMe. I mean, I'm a fan. So I'm a fan of the music. So I just had a bunch of questions about how they tour and how albums come together and how the band came together. Has the band ever had any problems? And Robby's story himself is really great too. Just his journey, his faith journey, that moment when he sort of had this aha moment that he knew that he was destined to pursue music and be in a band, and his love of the St. Louis Cardinals and baseball is really fun too. So I really think you guys will enjoy this episode. It's episode number 22 of the podcast with Robby Shaffer. And I just want to give this a little plug too. At the end of this interview, I'm going to tell you how you can win a copy of Robby and MercyMe's new album, Lifer. So I'm holding in my hand the CD, and it's called Lifer by MercyMe. It's a great, great album. There's so many good songs on here, including one that's very popular right now called Even If. We Win is a great song. Ghost, Best News Ever. I mean, there's just so many good songs on this album. It just came out a few months ago, and I want to give away a copy of it to you. So stay tuned at the end of this podcast, and I'll tell you how you can win a copy of MercyMe's new CD, Lifer. Without further ado, let's get right to it. Here is the drummer for MercyMe. His name is Robby Shaffer. Robby, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Man, it's great to talk to you. And so the new album's out now. It's called Lifer, and we'll get to a lot of your journey in a minute here. But I love this album. The first song that was sort of released to the K-Loves of the world and the radio world is Even If, which is just this powerful message that reminds us that when we go through trials and difficult moments, that God is with us in the midst, and that even if we don't get what we want, he's still good and there's still hope in him. What's been the response from fans around the world, really, on this new album?
Man, the follow-up for Welcome to the New, we knew had to have some legs in it because Welcome to the New was so amazing for us. But we wanted to follow up Welcome to the New, which is about grace and identity, with just letting the church know, give them encouragement that even when the struggles of the world seem to just weigh down on us, that there's still victory. We've read the last page of the book. We know how this whole thing ends. And so we wrote the record with that in mind. And then about the 11th hour, Even If kind of fell on our plate, and Bart was having a bad day, and most of our songs do, they come out of something in our life or some type of a life struggle. And Bart was having a bad day with his son, and his son has type 1 diabetes and has since he was 2.
Right.
And so this song just kind of fell in his lap. That a friend of ours, Tim Timmons, had started it, sent it over to Bart, and it was exactly what Bart was trying to say. And he's like, I have to finish this song. So he sat down with our producer, and within a day had finished the song out. So we put the song on the album, and we knew it was awesome. We wanted to make it a single, but we kind of had a plan already going into the album of what song was going to be our first release. But as record label people started hearing it, radio people started hearing it, everybody's like, why is this not your first single? And we're like, well, maybe it should be. Maybe there's a message here that people need to hear and have hope in. And so we decided to go ahead and put that out. And if there's one thing that we've learned in our 23 years of a career, it's that everybody goes through pain. Everybody goes through something at some point in their life, with the loss of a loved one or illness or just a hardship. And so we all can relate to it. And that's a song that kind of just gives us hope in the midst of that.
Yeah, it's a fantastic song. I listen to it consistently, probably on a daily basis, just because I believe God speaks to people through music in a way, for me, that when I hear that song, it just gives me encouragement. But just curious, Robbie, what was the song that you guys had a plan to release first? Which one was that?
Well, our song We Win that's on the album was the first song that we wrote for the album. We got into a little studio, not your typical studio, just kind of a big barn that was set up as a studio, but we were all in one big room. And it was just a writing process. And we got so excited about the song that we were writing that we finished it from beginning to end that day. We could have sent it off to a mix producer and he could have knocked it out that day. That's how finished it was. And we've never done that in our 23 years of a band.
Wow.
And so we were jumping around like little schoolboys, that are in high school and the band for the first time, like, holy cow, we wrote a song. And so we thought this song is going to be the first single. It's about victory. It gets you up. It's exciting. And then we thought the whole record was going to be that easy. And of course it wasn't. It took us a year to finish the rest of it. But that first song really got us going on the album and gave us that vision of what this album was supposed to be for.
Yeah, We Win is a great song, too. Again, there's so many good songs on this new album, Lifer, and We Win is such a cool reminder of just like, remember how the story ends here. This is what the whole idea of being a believer and being a Christian is about. We win. That's what it's about. Yeah, so
exactly.
This album has reached number 10 on the Billboard Top 100. If you're a Christian music fan, you'll hear their music obviously everywhere. K-Love, Air One, Sirius XM, The Message, they're everywhere. MercyMe is. And I've always wanted to know the exact process, Robbie, of how an album comes together. You started to describe it a little bit, the writing process from the conception to the release. So let's start with the very first thing that occurs. Is it a meeting that you guys all come together and decide, okay, we're going to make an album now? Or is it a song? Or just take me through the process, take us, the listener, through the process of the very beginning conception of an album?
I think the beginning process is the record label comes to us and says it's time.
Okay.
because after 20 years of doing this, it's like we want to just kind of sit back and relax and enjoy that we have an album out. But then what happens for us is we start getting restless playing the same songs.
Right.
And so we're like, okay, it's time to have some new material. Then the record label basically forces our hand and says, all right, it's time. Let's set a release date. And let's shoot for that. And so when you put us in a time crunch, we tend to work better. So when we're out on the road doing shows and stuff, so usually when we talk about the album, we talk about what the vision for the album would be, who we want to produce it, all the stuff that goes into it. And then, of course, the guys that play guitar and stuff like that, they're constantly just doodling around in their own little home studios, writing riffs and playing around with music. So they'll start sending, we have like a Dropbox that everybody throws their ideas into, and so Bart can hear them. And then we'll set a time, we'll get together, we'll start writing. And kind of the way We Win happened, it was just a writing session that turned into an actual recording. And we just sit down and go through all those ideas. And if there's anything that catches our attention, we pull it out and start working on it. If it hits, we put it back in the Dropbox and move on to something else, or we start writing something new at that time. But for the most part, it just comes down to it's time. Let's start doing this process. We really want to get to where we're just kind of writing throughout the year. But with our tour schedule and our family lives, it's really tough to get together and do that all the time. So that's the goal eventually.
When you start writing, what is that process like? Is it, when I say writing, I should say conceiving the song. So We Win, are you playing you're a drummer, obviously. So are you playing
Right.
the drums, and then is Nathan or some of the other guys, Barry, playing the guitar, and then Bart starts singing? Or is the song written, the words written, and then you kind of put music behind it? How does that work?
Well, so for instance, with We Win, that was one of those where Mike had written that guitar riff at home, made a little garage band type song to it, and threw it in that Dropbox. And so we pulled it out and said, hey, let's work on this. And so we just all started throwing our own parts on top of it, and it kind of developed. And then somebody'd say, well, let's play this chord, let's play that chord, or let's play this rhythm, or let's do this. And Bart came up with a melody on top of that. And then it just kind of starts. We've played together for so long, we kind of know where each other's going to go on the next part without having to say it out loud. And it just kind of fell into place that way. Sometimes it's Bart's like, hey, I have this song that I really have been listening to a lot. Let's write a song like that. And so we're like, okay. So if it's a more rock song, usually Mike takes the lead. If it's a more hip hop or funk sounding song, Barry will take the lead. If it's a ballad, Bart's kind of like, this is what I want. But we just have been together for so long. The writing process is not the same every time. It's just kind of what feels natural as we start doing it. And if there was a way that you could say, this is how you write a song, I would package it, write a book, and make $1 million. But it just is not that way. And so at least that's how it works for us as a band. I'm sure it's different for solo artists like a Jeremy Camp or somebody that writes their own music. But for us, it's just like we throw ideas out, and if something hits, we just run with it. So.
That's awesome. Well, we're talking to Robby Shaffer here. He is the drummer of the very successful band MercyMe, and we're going to talk about MercyMe in a second and sort of how the band came together. But Robby, I want to ask you about your journey and talk about you for a minute. How did your faith journey begin? When did you make your faith in Christ your own?
Well, I was pretty much raised in church my whole life. I think about 7 is the earliest that I remember understanding what having my own relationship in Christ was. The church I was going to, the kids' church time was called children's church. And so we would do main praise and worship with the church, and then they would break us off and we'd go into children's church. And that's where I really believe that I found my own relationship with Christ at about 7. And being raised, in the church in a Christian home with a godly family. My dad, when I was 10, became the worship leader at our church. And so I was in and around worship music. And I think 5th grade, I started homeschooling. So I was pretty much at home a lot with my family and around faith. And so, yeah, I don't really have like a testimony per se, but I heard a preacher say one time that the best testimony is not what God brought you out of, but what he kept you from getting into. And so I feel like with where he placed me in the family that I have, he's just really surrounded me with really good influences, good friends, good family, so that I could just grow in relationship with him without having to go through some of the hardships and the trials that people do early in life. And so, yeah, I started at 7 and, walked this walk as best as I can ever since.
So, Robby, was there ever a time, and growing up as a believer, obviously that's great. I know people who were raised in Christian homes who had trouble with their walk with the Lord, maybe, doubted God or whatever it was. Did that ever happen with you? Was there ever a moment where, you were just like, all right, God, is this real? Or you were just angry with him, or you just didn't want to have a relationship with him?
I don't ever remember having a time where I just butted heads with God over anything. I know at the end of my high school life, when I was about to graduate, I knew that sports was not in my future. And I didn't know really what I wanted to do with my life. I didn't know if I wanted to go to college. I knew God had a plan for me. I was sure about that. And so I'm playing baseball the last summer, right after I graduate, playing American Legion baseball, and we're traveling, doing tournaments. And my parents get back from a conference and they're like, "Hey, we want you to go to this summer camp." And I'm like, "What? Summer camp? I'm 18 years old. I haven't gone to summer camp since I was 12. And you want me to leave a week of baseball and go to a summer camp?" They're like, "Well, you're struggling with what you want to do with your future. And we just think maybe God will show you if you go here." And so I fought them. I really did. I wasn't rebellious about it, but I was pretty adamant that no, I don't want to do this. And so I just felt like God softened my heart to it and said, "You know what? You need to honor your parents, do what they say, and go do it." So I went into it with, okay, I'm going to honor my parents, but I'm not happy about it. And so I went to this youth camp, and it was a great week of camp for me. I met some new friends, whatever, but that's really where God spoke to me and said, "I want you to use drums, and that's how I want you to be in ministry, and I want you to use drums. That's how you're going to do this." And so that was the first time I really felt him give me a clear direction on what he wanted me to do with my life. And it didn't involve college, which, at that time, that was what you did. I think it still is today, even though there's more chances for kids to do more, particular type of studying. But for me, it was just go to college and then see what happens. And so I went back, told my parents what God said. They felt like, yeah, it's exactly what we were feeling. And so I did this internship. It's actually at that youth camp. I ended up going back there, and that's where I met MercyMe. That's where I got involved in music heavily. And I think that I look back on that time of my life where I just questioned, what am I doing? And God, why haven't you told me what to do? And that's where that time where I just decided I'm going to honor my parents' wishes and do it. And then he just opened up these doors for me. And so not really a hardship, but it's just a time where I just questioned, what am I doing? So
yeah, that's a great story. And I think everybody, whether their walk with Christ has been, one that's not been necessarily smooth, but just kind of consistent, or if you've doubted the Lord or had, moments, I think we all have those times when we can look back and be like, okay, that was a big turning point for me. So that's a great story. Now, you also told me a story off air that I got to get in here in the podcast. I got to hear about this. So you mentioned about a time when you were 14 years old and it involved Bibles and China. Just tell me what happened with that. I want to hear this story.
So I had a cousin, and her husband were missionaries in China. They would go over and spend a year or 2 years, and they would, not only would they find themselves inside communist China for a year, but they would help a local church in Hong Kong. At that time, Hong Kong was still separate from China, and so it was still a free country or a free city opposed from the communism of China. And so they would work with the local church in Hong Kong to get Bibles smuggled into China. And so their cover was they were English teachers. And so under that cover, they would start these house churches, I guess you would call them, underground house churches. And about every, 12 to 18 months, they would come home, kind of recoup for a month or two, reload, raise some support, and then head back over to China. Well, one of these summers, they came back and said, "Hey, we're going to take just for 10 days, we're going to take a short-term missions trip and bring people over to help us smuggle some Bibles in." And they went around to different churches and, approached other people who wanted to do it, raise your own support type of thing. Well, I felt like I was supposed to. At that time, Teen Mania and a lot of these, teenage mission trips in the summer was a really big thing, but I never really felt like I was called to the mission field at all. But I also felt like as a teenager, you should at least try it once just to see if this is what God wants you to do. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, this is an interesting way for me to see if short-term missions is something I want to do, or being missions at all is what God wants me to do. So I told him, yeah, I want to go. Well, then my mom felt like God was calling her to go. And so together, which probably made it a lot easier on me to have my mom there with me at 14, but we raised our support and went with my cousins and a team of, I think there was like 15 of us. For 10 days, we went to Hong Kong, and four separate days, loaded up backpacks, duffel bags, strapped them to our bodies, whatever we could do to hide these Bibles and get them across the border into communist China. And 3 out of the 4 times I made it through without getting caught. And then one time I did get caught. And so
what happened when you got caught? What happened when you got caught?
Yeah, luckily we're American and they don't really do anything. They just say, no, you can't do this. And you argue and you say, well, these are English teaching books. And they're like, no, this is the Bible. And so for me, they just said, hey, put them in this bag. They gave me a receipt, said, have somebody else pick them up, when you come back through the border. Well, with my mom, she actually got caught with one other person, and they put her in a side room and interrogated her for 4 hours. And, not physically, but just, when you're in a foreign country and you're doing something illegal to them, it's a little scary. And so you really rely on the Holy Spirit to comfort you at that point. And so her and this other person, they finally got let go, and they're walking down the street and they can see they're following them. So they'll pass people on their team and give them the signal, don't follow me. I'm being followed. So finally, after a time, they were able to meet back up and come back across the border. But I'll tell you one thing. I learned 2 things. I learned how to listen to the Holy Spirit's leading, and I learned I do not want to go in the mission field on that trip, because it was a great time for me to know what the Holy Spirit's voice sounded like to me, to tell me, all right, now go through the border now, or wait. And he would set up distractions, and then I would go through or whatever. But it also just taught me that, as much as I want to be in ministry, being overseas was just not for me. It was not my cup of tea. So,
have you ever played in China as a band?
Have not. We have not done a ton of stuff overseas, at least in the Europe or Asia side. We did a USO tour in the Middle East. We played in Australia. We've gone to London to do some recording, but we've never played over there. And of course, we've done, some Mexico and South America. Well, we've been asked to go to Brazil, but it fell through. But we haven't had a ton of opportunities to go overseas yet.
Okay, we're talking to Robby Shaffer here. He is the drummer for the band MercyMe, and I want to talk about MercyMe now, Robby. And just, you mentioned the camp that you were part of and that you went to sort of reluctantly, and then you ended up interning and you met the band. So let's go back. I read that you joined the band in 1997, but take us back to the early days, first of all, of you guys meeting and coming together and how you ended up in the band. And then we'll talk about just what it was like back then, just starting out as a band and trying to get your music heard by different people. So take us back to those early days.
Yeah. So in 94, 95 is when I did that internship. And so the drummer that I looked up to and kind of became my mentor while I was at that internship, he was one of the biggest studio drummers in Oklahoma City at the time. And so if he was playing in town or he had anything going on and I was free, I was there. I just wanted to be around him, learn from him, glean from me the knowledge that he could give me. And so I was at church one Sunday and he's like, hey, I just recorded this week with this young band and they're awesome. I think you would love them and would like to get to know them. We're playing this weekend at there's like a Christian club there in town. It's like, all right, I'll be there. So I show up and met the guys. They're great guys, just became friends with them. They played a couple other times in town that I would go and show up and get to know. Well, then during that time, they didn't really have a solid drummer. So they would take my friend that was my mentor, or they would take another couple drummers I knew in town out. And one time they couldn't find a drummer. Like, we have a conference in Dallas this weekend. It's just a youth conference, but we don't have a drummer. And Trent, who was my mentor, was like, you should take Robby. He would do fine. And so they're like, well, we're going to try you out. I'm like, okay. So that was my first experience, was a youth conference in Dallas. And I think during that time of MercyMe's career, when they were first starting out on their first album, they had like, 15 or 16 drummers at that point. So I was one of those. And
Wow.
then after I had, played with them a few times, they were still picking up other drummers to fill in, just because they wanted Trent, who was my mentor at the time, but he had a family. He was, working all the time in Oklahoma City, just couldn't travel. He wasn't a traveling drummer. And so they would just pick up guys to just kind of fill in. And finally, after about 2.5 years of doing that, and me filling in from time to time, doing youth camps and little conferences with them here and there, they're like, we need to solidify a drummer, and we think you're the guy. So that was around the holidays of coming into the year of 97. And so starting in 97, I became a full member. And our bass player, Nathan, he is my brother-in-law. At the time, he was just dating my sister, and I'd grown up with him in church. But our bass player was getting off the road to start a family, and like, we need a bass player too. So later that summer, I was like, well, my sister's dating this kid that I grew up with, and he can sing and play. And they're like, bring him out. So he came out and auditioned, and I think he played like 3 songs with us, and then helped us work on our bus and play volleyball the rest of the time. They're like, hey, he works, bring him out. So yeah, that's how Nathan got in the band. And of course, we're family now, but at the time, it was just somebody I knew from growing up.
Well, you're very young when this band comes together. You're 21, 22 years old. Is this kind of like, we'll see, it's cool, it's like a great experience being a part of a band and playing music? Or did you have a vision that like this is something early on that you knew, hey, I might be, this is going to be a big part of my life?
Well, I don't think any of us at that time knew it would get to where we are right now, but we all had the same passion. We all wanted to lead people in worship. We all wanted to do music as our sole occupation. And so finding 5 other guys that could have the same vision was very helpful for me, because I had played in a couple other small bands, but they were just doing it for fun. And I traveled with, worship pastors from the church and the camp, but they just do it on the side to help promote the camp in the summer. So it wasn't really anything full time there. And that was my goal, and that was my longing. And so when I found the band and found like-mindedness, we're like, let's do this. And I mean, for that first, from about 90, for them, from 95 until about 2000, we were on the road for anywhere from 250 to 300 days a year.
Wow.
Just, doing weekend youth conferences and summer camps. I mean, a summer camp, you do 10 straight weeks of summer camp starting the last week of May, and you're at a camp for 5 days, and then you pack up, you go to the next camp, do it all over the next week. And
it is not glamorous life, right, Robbie?
No, you're living in campgrounds or dormitories on a college campus or whatever. And I just think back to when you were a kid, you went to camp for 1 week. Well, at the end of that 1 week, you're exhausted. You're like, oh my gosh, give me a real shower, give me real food, give me a real bed. Well, we did that for 10 weeks straight.
Wow.
And it was just different camps, different states. And so we did that all the way up until almost to 2000, when we signed our record deal. And then the shows, we still kept doing a lot of shows and a lot of traveling, but they became more like concert style settings versus doing the camps and the conferences all the time. So
right. And then so in 2000, you say you signed your first record deal. How big of a moment was that for you guys? Like, that had to be like that unbelievable, like, oh my gosh, we've made it moment.
We tried to do it in like 96 and 97, and the right connections weren't there. And so we decided we'll just wait on God. We moved to Dallas so we could be more centrally located to the areas, the Bible Belt that we were playing most of the time. And Bart got married, and this is where he's from. And so we just stopped pursuing a record deal. And then we wrote Imagine in 99, and it just kind of took off on our independent album. And so bookstores started calling, asking for those albums. Radio stations started wanting to play those songs. And we just got to where we outgrew it. We couldn't keep it. I was doing the books. I was calling bookstores, trying to get them to pay us for the albums that we sent them. And we just couldn't keep up with it. We couldn't keep sending out the CDs. And, there's like 250 bookstores that were asking for our albums. I'm like, we are not a record label. We are not a distribution center. We need some help. And so we just started making phone calls to some connections that we had made in Nashville. And Jeff Mosley, who was our record label president, fell in our lap, and he came to Dallas and met with us, and he's like, let's sign you guys. I have faith in you. And we're like, all right, let's do this. And so it took about a year after signing a record deal, getting a booking agent and management for it to feel like we were on a record deal.
Right.
That first year we were just fulfilling a lot of the things that we already had on our plate, and a lot of the old shows and camps and stuff that we had booked already. And so it was about a year into actually being on a record label where we started doing real concerts, real tours, real radio interviews, that sort of thing. So,
well, you mentioned the song Imagine. You're obviously referring to I Can Only Imagine, which
yes,
is one of the most played, if not the most played Christian song I think that's ever in existence. It's an amazing, powerful song. I've been to numerous funerals where that song's been played. I've been to numerous different places where you hear that song. And I remember, I got to tell you my story real quick, Robbie. I became a Christian in 2001. It took me a little while to really understand what it meant for my faith walk and what it meant to have salvation and to understand who Jesus was and what he had done for us. But you become drawn to certain types of music. And I remember hearing I Can Only Imagine for the first time and thinking, what a powerful song, what a representation of what it will be like someday when we all get to heaven to spend eternity with Christ. So I hear that song and I know it, and it's sort of my own little, this is my little Christian song that I know that a lot of people don't know. And then I remember being on a trip. I was going on a trip for a weekend with my wife and my sister and my stepsister and her boyfriend at the time. And we're having on this sort of like, I don't know what you call it, like soft rock type station. And then all of a sudden this song is played and we're on the road and I say, turn that song up. And I said, that's not supposed to happen. That's my Christian song, I Can Only Imagine. And that's on a quote, for lack of a better word, a secular radio station. And I remember thinking, wow, this song is becoming big.
Only imagine when all I would do is forever worship you. I can only imagine.
What was that moment like for you when I Can Only Imagine goes from that circle of sort of Bible Belt concerts that you're playing to all of a sudden the entire nation and probably the entire world in many ways are talking about this song?
Man, it was really surreal because we had gone through the whole of it blowing up on Christian radio, and we'd moved on. We were on our second album. We were rehearsing for a tour we had coming up and had our second single out. It was doing really well. And a friend of ours in Dallas called Bart and was like, hey, they're playing Imagine on this. It was pretty much just a shock jock radio station, kind of like a Jack FM mainstream station in town. And their DJs are, really just whatever they can do to push the envelope is what they do. And they're playing it on this station.
Wow.
And we're like, there's no way. And like, oh yeah, they played it twice already. And so we, on our way home or that morning, we turned on the radio and didn't really hear it. But then the next day we were interested to see what would happen. Heard it again. And they said, we got a lot of requests for this song yesterday, so we're going to play it again. So through a series of connections through us and our friend and our record label, we ended up talking to the DJs that morning, finding out what was going on. And so apparently they have a dare, and they've always said, we'll do whatever on the air, you dare us, we'll do it. Somebody called in and dared them to play I Can Only Imagine. And they're like, well, that's not really our format. We're not. And he's like, well, you said you'd do anything. And he's like, well, I don't know that song. I don't have a copy of it. Well, their producer for the morning show is like, well, I have that in my car. He's like, all right, bring it in. So he went out, brought it in, they played it, and for the next 3 hours, their phone would not stop ringing. And the DJ's like, please stop calling us. We will play this song again. Please stop calling us. And so they had to know where the song came from, what it was, what it meant. And so Bart got on, talked to him on the air, and then they had us in the next week to do an actual on-air interview and play the song live. And it just basically went from a dare to our record label saying, okay, this could do something. What if every station took a chance? And so we literally wrote on the CD, sent it out to all these mainstream stations, top 40 and soft AC, said, play it once. If you get no response, throw it away. Don't care. But if you get a response, maybe there's something to it. And so a lot of these stations did that. A lot of them said, all right, we'll do it. And our radio department kind of helped push it along. And before you know it, it's being played on mainstream. The one song that you would think would never go on a mainstream radio station is the one that did well. And it was on on mainstream stations for 9 months, and people would battle it on their stations. This one place in Florida would not play it. And they said, all right, we'll play it, but we're going to put it in our battle. And at that time, In the Club by 50 Cent was the top song. So right. They put it up against 50 Cent, which was their top song. And Imagine got 100% of the votes that day. And
Holy cow.
They said, okay, we'll play the song. And so, that's pretty much how it happened. Not every station took a chance. Not every station had the same response, but enough that it got noticed all across the country. And it's so easy as a band to think, wow, we have mainstream success. Let's start writing mainstream songs. But that's just, even our record label said, well, maybe we should start writing songs that could go one way or the other. And we're like, no. I mean, the only reason this song got played is because it's so blatantly Christian.
Right.
It's like people wanting to play something to push the envelope in a bad way. They were pushing the envelope in a good way, to the point to where some people would call and cuss them out because, hey, why are you playing Jesus songs on my station? And so we just continue to write songs the way we write songs. That we had a couple other songs because of the success of Imagine that got played on some mainstream stations, but that was never our intent. Our intent was to write songs the way we write songs. If they get played, great. If they don't, no hard feelings, because we write songs for the church and we write songs out of life experiences. And so it's pretty crazy.
It is crazy, because I remember, the words, surrounded by your glory, what will my heart feel? I want to dance with you, Jesus, or in awe of you be still. Like, that's Jesus playing on mainstream radio. And I remember thinking, man, as a Christian, I'm thinking that's the coolest thing ever. This song is ministering to so many people and that's why I ask, in my head, I think, why does that song, and why do songs like that? Because there are others. I remember Jesus Take the Wheel from Carrie Underwood was very popular. Like, there's songs with Jesus in it. But what is it that resonates with people, even the non-believer? Is it just that idea of hope and that idea of just wondering what it will be like, when we're all gone? Like, why do you think that resonated?
Yeah, I think it's the same reason that Even If is doing so well on the radio right now is everybody at some point in their life has lost a loved one, or has a memory of a grandfather or a father or a mother or a son or a daughter that they've lost while they're on this earth. And that pain and that hope, the pain they feel here, but that hope of seeing them again one day. And, Bart wrote it when his dad passed away of cancer. So he wrote it from that feeling, from that pain, from that hope of seeing his dad again one day. And when it was written that way, I think everybody in this world, whether you know Christ or not, can relate to it. And so putting it out there at a funeral for people to hear for the first time because their loved one passed away and they may not know Christ, but they hear that song, it gives them hope. And so it's still in the top 10 of iTunes downloads, just because every day we hear people and we get messages on our Facebook page of saying, man, I just heard your song yesterday for the first time. We're like, what? That song's been out for 18 years. How in the world are you just now hearing it? But it's for that reason. It gets played at a funeral. It gets played in the car or something when somebody's going through a hard time, and it just connects. And it just, we call it the song that won't go away.
Yeah, but that's a good thing. And that's the beauty of music is I didn't discover this little band called the Beatles until I was 22 years old. And then I was like,
exactly.
Oh my Lord, this is so good, and it's just so, what, that's the beauty of music. We're talking to Robby Shaffer. He is the drummer of MercyMe. And, we might as well talk a little sports, Robby, because it is a Sports Spectrum podcast. So is it fair to say the old adage of musicians wanting to be athletes and athletes wanting to be musicians holds true for you? You mentioned you were a baseball player all the way through American Legion. Is that true, you would say?
I run into athletes all the time that are like, man, I play guitar and we just want to be in a band. And I was in a golf tournament with the former Dallas Cowboy yesterday. And he was telling me that while he was a Cowboy, him and some of the linemen on the Cowboys team put together this little band because they love playing music, and they got some gigs around town, and that's all they cared about was they know they do sports for their for their career and for their occupation, but they love music. Well, for whatever reason, musicians love sports and musicians love to get to know athletes. And when I realized I wasn't going to be able to play sports, professionally, I was like, well, maybe my music career will get me in the door to meet some of these guys. And so luckily over time, I've been able to meet some athletes and become friends with them, which is huge for me.
Who is your sports hero, Robby?
Goodness. My sports hero when I was a kid was Ozzie Smith.
The Wizard.
The Wizard, just because I was such a big Cardinals fan and big baseball fan. I've had several people I really looked up to over the years. Kurt Warner was a big one. When I was just starting out with MercyMe, he was really popular, MVP and stuff like that. And what's ironic is when I saw you the other day at a function we were at together, Sports Spectrum was a magazine that I got as a kid because my parents wouldn't allow me to get Sports Illustrated because of the swimsuit edition. So they found this, or I found this in a Christian bookstore, this magazine called Sports Spectrum. And to me, it was just like Sports Illustrated, except it had Christian testimonies in it from all these athletes. And so I subscribed to it. And for years, I got Sports Spectrum every month or every other month whenever it came out. And what that did is turned me on to all these athletes that I didn't know were Christians. And so I became fans of all these athletes thinking, wow, they're Christians, so I got to be fans of them for sure. And so people like Barry Sanders and some of the pitchers that, like Dave Dravecky and some of those guys back in the day, were on the cover. And so a lot of the sports figures that I kind of clung on to, you said sports heroes, but the ones that I really followed at that point were people that I read about in Sports Spectrum.
Well, you can get a subscription because the magazine still exists if you'd like one. We can talk about that off the air. How's that, Robbie?
That's awesome to know. I'll be getting that.
Absolutely. And it's good to have you on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Now, I saw you talked about meeting, your heroes, meeting some of the players that are you're rooting for on a daily basis. So, and just to give an example, I recently saw, some posts on Instagram with you and the band, and even with your kids getting to be on the field at a St. Louis Cardinals game. You mentioned Ozzie Smith. So what a thrill that must be able to be for you to be connected to your team, your favorite team growing up, and be on the field and take batting practice and all that. How cool is that?
Oh man, it's like top 5 moments of my life. So Mike Matheny, when he was a player back in early 2000s, because of the song I Can Only Imagine being popular at the time, I was able to kind of get my foot in the door with him and get to know him a little bit. And so we've been friends all through his career. And then when he retired, I kind of lost touch with him for a couple of years while he was off coaching his kids' Little League Baseball. And then all of a sudden he becomes the manager of the St. Louis Cardinals. And I'm like, wow, that's a good connection to have. And so he asked us to come and do his charity golf tournament and banquet that he does every year. And we did that last year. And he said, come in early. We'll go out on the field. We'll watch BP. We'll take some BP. And I'm like, what? I get to go on Busch Stadium with the baseball bat and hit a baseball. And so for me, I'm friends with Adam Wainwright as well. But for me, going out there with Matheny, who's been a friend of mine for 15 years or whatever, and have him throw batting practice to me on Busch Stadium's field with nobody else out there but us. Oh my goodness.
Did you get a hit at least? Did you hit the ball? You didn't strike out, did you?
According to him, I got some hits, yes.
Okay.
So that's
according to him. So you have no memory because you were so in awe of everything.
Right? Well, he said they were hits, so I'm just going to take his word for it.
That's right. He played in the majors, right? So take his word for it.
He would tell me if it was a double, if that was a single, or if that was an easy pop out. He was being very honest with us.
So who are some of the other sports personalities or people that you've had opportunities to network with, especially later in your career? And because you guys play a lot of faith days, faith nights at baseball stadiums, I'm just curious, just from a sports perspective, what that's like, just being connected as a MercyMe the band, which really is, when you look at MercyMe, it's not like, from the surface you would say, oh, there's definitely a sports correlation there. But I mean, I took you and I took a bunch of other members of the band, including Bart and Barry, on tours at ESPN. So just to have you guys want to come to ESPN tells me how big of sports fans you are. What's that been like, just as a band being able to kind of be connected into the sports world?
Man, for me, it's awesome. I love sports of all kinds. Baseball's my favorite, of course, my first love. But I love watching sports and learning about sports and getting involved and having teams to root for. And so whenever you see these players that to the rest of the world are top athletes and people know who they are and they're superstars, and then to get to actually meet them and see that they love Jesus, man, that really makes my heart happy. And so getting to meet people like R.A. Dickey, and there's a pitcher, Jeremy Affeldt, who's MVP for the it was maybe 3-time San Francisco Giants, back earlier in the 2010, 2011, we're in there.
Yeah.
And to meet these guys and see that they are the same person on the field as they are off the field. Albert Pujols is a big one. When I met Matheny, he introduced me to Albert Pujols, and I've been friends with him ever since. Now I don't talk to him as much now that he's out in LA, so I don't see him as often. But some of these players that we come in contact with on a yearly basis, we have their cell phones and we text them and we say hi to them, and we're at a show, they come out to our show. If we're in town and we can go to see a game that they're performing in, we go out and do that. I got a friend, he doesn't play golf anymore, but he was on the PGA Tour, Paul Stankowski, goes to my church. And then Tony Romo and Witten go to church around here. Tony goes to my church, which I've only said hi to him once, so I can't say I'm a friend with him or anything. But like my pastor and some of the people that I hang out with all the time, they're in his life and discipling him, and he's the real deal. And to hear these guys that are superstars and they're in the news and they're on ESPN and they're talked about on Twitter and social media and morning shows, and to know that their hearts are Christ first, family second, and then their career, it makes me happy.
A couple more with Robby Shaffer here from MercyMe. So Robby, I got to ask from a band perspective now. You know, I mentioned earlier that I discovered the Beatles when I was 22, and it changed the way I listened to music forever, right? As they did with so many other people. So, but I watched a ton of documentaries and read a ton of books on the Beatles early on. And you know, and they only were together for 9 or 10 years. And all of a sudden, they have their breakup in 1970. It's a gigantic deal. It's before I was even born. So I just ask from a band perspective, because you guys have been together so long, over 20 years. Has there been a time when you guys thought, we might not make it here? How do you still make it work and stay together and be successful as a band after so many years?
Yeah, we had that time probably about 5-6 years ago now. We had that time in our career to where it was just getting really hard. It felt like it went from a passion. It felt like what we were called to do was just becoming a mundane scenario of going to work every day. And we sat down and talked about it, and we were kind of in a dark place, spiritually dark place within the band and some things. And we're like, do we just call it quits? Is it time? Because we've always said we'll do this as long as we're still seeing fruits from the ministry, as long as people are still being touched, as long as lives are still being changed by our music, we'll continue to do this. And we're like, does that time come? Have we reached that point? And so we sat down, we said, well, let's try and fix what's broken. And before we just call it quits. And so we cut our dates by 40%. We went from 110 down to about 65, 70 shows a year. We sold our buses, paid off whatever little outstanding debts we had, just to, because you cut your income by 40%, you got to cut some of the overhead. And so
absolutely.
So we started changing up our processes just so we could be home with our families more. We could travel less, which is why we don't see as many baseball games, because we're not on the road as much anymore. But we tried to fix, and our perspective of the gospel changed. We started realizing who we are in Christ, and that our identity is not what you see on stage. Our identity is not MercyMe. Our identity is the Spirit that lives inside of us every day, and that's who we are. We're holy, we're righteous, and redeemed. And so once our perspective of who we are in Christ started changing, then our perspective of what we were doing for our career, for our job, started changing. We started seeing it in a different light. And so we took about a month and a half, 2 months off, regrouped, and then went into the process, that writing process we started talking about earlier, of writing the Welcome to the New album. And we went into that saying, you know what, we've been writing music for radio, what radio wants. We've been writing with what we think the church wants to hear. Let's write fun songs. Let's write music that we want to sing. Let's write stuff that we want our kids to listen to. Let's give it a message that gives people hope and gives them an idea of what grace and identity in Christ truly is. And so when we started refocusing our minds on what we were doing and how this is not, the job part of it is not our identity, but who Christ in us is, then the freedom that came from that and the ability to go out and have fun again. We loved being on stage again. We loved playing music again. And I think it really came across in the album. It came across in our live shows. And I think that's where this kind of newfound MercyMe 2.0 came from. It's just that hard time in our life where we almost called it quits.
Welcome to the
I'm asking this, I guess, from a sports perspective, because, even the best baseball player strikes out or gets out 7 times out of 10.
Exactly.
And even Steph Curry misses half the 3-pointers that he takes. Do you guys ever mess up? Like, I watch bands and I don't know music enough to know in a concert when there's a mess up. But is that obvious within the band? Or are you guys like, man, I botched that, and the fans don't even notice, but you guys notice?
Oh, it's not if we mess up; it's how many times a night. So
Okay.
the same way that an athlete will give out the game ball to somebody who has a good game, we give out the game ball to whoever messes up the most that night. And so
That's great.
I would say 95 to 99% of the time, the average fan out in the crowd does not know when we've messed up. But there are those rare occasions where somebody starts a song in the wrong key, or they're I drop a stick and miss like a whole bar of playing because I can't play without my sticks, or somebody hits a bad note, or if sometimes it's technical issues where your computer goes down, so your tracks and your clicks and your video, all that goes off, and so you're just kind of sitting there with your pants down, like, okay, I guess we'll just keep playing and see what happens. And so there are rare nights that happens, but the most of the time, those little small things that go wrong, you would not notice. But it does change our appearance on stage, because you'll see all of us look at that person and start laughing. If we can point, we point. And so if I mess up, you'll see all four heads turn and look right at me and start laughing. And so that's a clear cue. If you're out in the audience, you don't really know what just happened, but you see them laughing at me, then you'll know I just messed up somehow. So
That's hilarious. Robbie, do you have like 10 more minutes?
Sure.
Perfect. Okay. I have like 4 more questions that I want to get to. I just think that they're fun questions. All right. Okay. I'm going to pick it up right from that. So when you're on tour, who decides all the different things that go into a set? Who chooses the music, the order of the songs? Do you guys play the same kind of set each concert? Because it's different audiences, obviously nobody's probably going to hear the same thing, or do you try to mix it up and kind of surprise them a little bit with an old school song or something, or even a cover, something like that?
Yeah, usually when the new album comes out, we want to play as many of the new songs as possible. One for our own pleasure, because we're so excited about a new album.
Right.
But 2, to see which songs are going to work well live. Just because it's great on an album doesn't mean it conveys the same feeling live. Sometimes it's because of the way it's recorded, type of music it is, whatever. And so you want to really base it off of crowd response. And so for that first, 10 or 15 shows after a new album comes out, we're really trying to just push a lot of the new songs to see what's going to feel great. And then we'll put the hits in there, obviously, of what's been strong on radio over the past 10 years for us. And so once we kind of solidify what songs feel good and kind of the order that we want them in, then we kind of stick with that set list, or versions of that set list, depending on how long they've asked us to play. If it's a 60-minute set or an hour-and-a-half set or whatever, we'll keep that same kind of set list, for the next year and a half or whatever. And most bands do that just because it's easier for your production, for your video, your lighting guy, when they have to sit down for hours and program lights to songs. If you just start changing it up every night, then they're having to rework all the stuff and come up with new concepts, new videos and stuff like that. Occasionally we get tired of playing the same old songs, and so we'll, for our own sake, throw an old one in, or we'll get a request for an old song or a favorite from somebody in the crowd, like at a meet and greet or a question and answer time, and they'll say, can you play this song? And we'll either say, no, we've never played that song live, or it's been 15 years since we played it, or if it's one that we're pretty current and one that's we're familiar with, and we're like, yeah, we'll throw it in the set just for you. And so we do have those occasional times where we do that.
That's
but
cool.
Once we solidify it, we try and stick to it as best as we can for the next, album cycle if we can. So.
No, that makes sense. Complete sense. Now, I'm just curious on this. What is the absolute coolest moment you've had being the drummer for MercyMe? Now, you mentioned meeting Mike Matheny and hitting baseballs at Busch Stadium, which I can imagine if I was doing that with my Mets at Citi Field, I would freak out as well. But other than that, was there a moment where you just pinched yourself and said, seriously, I'm here doing this? What was that moment? Man,
I'm going to give you 3 examples.
Okay.
The first one would be a Billy Graham crusade. His last crusade. We did 3 of them with him. We did one in LA, Kansas City, and then his last crusade was in New York, up in I guess it would be the Meadowlands, wherever they play the U.S. Open up there. And we were on stage, and they told us, there's 200,000 people out here for his last crusade. And I'm up there, and we can't. It's just this people as far as you can see, and so you don't get nervous in that because you can't see their faces. It's like the little 50 people right in front of you that makes you nervous because they're just like you just see them right there.
That's right.
But you're up there playing. You're like, how in the world are we here? It's like, what steps got us to this point? So that's one of them. Another one is we got a chance to go over and do a USO tour over in the Middle East, and we got to play on 3 different Army bases or Navy bases, whichever city we were in, and perform for the soldiers, perform for the families of those soldiers, and then get to talk to them and meet them, tell them thank you face to face. And this was back when it was still, Afghanistan was still pretty rough over there, and so they wouldn't let us go in and go out to the front lines, and it's too dangerous. But we were able to kind of stay behind the scenes and see the people that were on the bases and their families. And that was one of those deals when we're out there and you're seeing, Patriot missiles right in front of you, actually get to climb on them and touch them. You're just like, man, we are right here in the middle of what's protecting our freedom. But we're out here giving hope to these soldiers and the families of these soldiers. So that was pretty surreal and something that I'll never forget that we got to do. And then just recently we got to play the presidential prayer breakfast and to sit in a room of 2,000 leaders from all over the world that are influential in the way we do life on an everyday basis. And to see that they're there for one purpose, and it's to pray for our country, to pray for the world, pray for peace. And to know that we had a small part in that morning and a small part in that time of seeing these, because you hear about Washington and it's all corrupt and politicians are just, right side, left side, and they're all out for their own agendas. But then to see the senators that are Republican and Democrat sitting side by side, holding hands, praying for their country, man, that really, really, really is special. And so that was something that we got to be a part of just this past January. It was really neat.
One more question for Robby Shaffer here from MercyMe, and I asked this to all of our guests on the podcast, so I'm going to ask you, Robby Shaffer, what right now has God been teaching you?
Man, one thing I think he's been teaching me is just to have grace in all situations, whether it's towards my kids, towards my wife, towards the band members, is knowing that we all have bad days. And on those days when I have a bad day and I raise my voice to my kids and I know I shouldn't, and I may go and apologize to them and say, I'm sorry, Daddy shouldn't talk to you that way. Seeing the grace in their eyes to forgive me has really taught me how to learn to show grace to everybody else. So when they have bad days or they're not being who Christ wants them to be, I can look at them and say, you know what? Tomorrow morning, his mercies are new. Every day, his mercies are new. So it's almost like you wake up the next day and you're back to zero. And being able to have been shown grace through the cross and shown grace, from the band guys and from my wife and from my kids, it's really teaching me to be able to, in return, show grace to the people around me, knowing, you know what, this TSA agent is having a bad day. So I need to encourage them and tell them and just laugh it off and say, you know what, you're working a really hard job and you're trying to protect us. So I'll go with it. I don't think this is right, but you know what, I'm going to show you some grace and just trust that you're having a bad day. And so I think that's the thing that I've really, because I'm not a very patient person. I'm very type A, and I don't like people without common sense. And so that gets it gets under my skin. And so I get really agitated when that stuff happens. And so I'm really trying to have the Holy Spirit help me learn how to show grace in those situations.
He is Robby Shaffer, the drummer for MercyMe. He's also a husband and a father and a gigantic St. Louis Cardinals fan. And we do appreciate having him on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Robby, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Oh, not a problem at all. I'm glad you asked me. I'm the drummer and I don't usually get to talk much.
Now go subscribe to Sports Spectrum. How's that?
It's done. I'm going to do it as soon as I get off.
We do appreciate you, Robby Shaffer, for joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And I hope you all enjoyed listening to that interview. Robby's a great guy, and I just like taking kind of a peek behind the curtain and learning how the music industry works, and Robby's heart and the band MercyMe's heart for people, for God, and just kind of hearing some cool stories of being in the band, and just Robby's love and passion for baseball and for sports is really neat too. So we do appreciate Robby Shaffer joining us here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. As mentioned, we're giving away a copy of MercyMe's new CD called Lifer, and it's out now. It's been out for a couple months, and it's a really great CD. It's a really great album, and I could not recommend it more. Their song "Even If" is just blowing up right now on the Christian radio charts, and they've been a band a long time, and they're still putting out really great content, really great music. So we want to give away a copy of their CD, Lifer, to you. Here's how you can win it. It's very simple. We've been doing this with a few of the podcasts. Go to iTunes. So go to iTunes and leave a review. Leave a review on iTunes. Mention Robby Shaffer or MercyMe. Just put that in the review. You know, you listened to the podcast and you heard that interview and whatever you thought of it, just mention Robby, mention MercyMe, and you're automatically entered for a chance to win a copy of MercyMe's new CD, Lifer. Now, when you leave that review, in a couple of days or so, I'll go in and we'll put the names in a hat or something, and we'll pull out a winner, and then we'll announce the winner in a future podcast. Probably the next podcast or the podcast after that is when we'll announce the winner. And so when we do announce that winner, it'll be simple. You just contact me with your address and your information, and I will mail you out this CD. So go to iTunes, leave a review, let us know that you heard the interview with Robby Shaffer from MercyMe, and you're automatically entered for a chance to win their new CD, Lifer. Thank you so much for joining us here on episode number 22 of the podcast. We will see you next time here on Sports Spectrum.